Today, 40 years ago, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining was released. Today, I take you on a journey on how Stanley Kubrick made The Shining. In 1974, Stanley Kubrick was finishing up production on what would become his next film, Barry Lyndon, a period piece drama that takes place in the 18th century. The film was released in 1975 and would go on to win 4 Oscars.
John Alcott for Barry Lyndon.
Ken Adam and Roy Walker for Barry Lyndon. Venom Dixon for Fletcher.
Ulla Britt Soderlund and Melina Candanero for Barry Lyndon.
Leonard Roseman for Barry Lyndon.
Though Kubrick did not win any of those Oscars, he was nominated. Barry Lyndon's initial release was met with critical and commercial failure, as many people expected a more exciting film based on the 1975 blockbuster season started with Jaws. Instead, what people got was a story about a young Irish rogue that survives battle and treachery.
I think, Stanley was disappointed because, well, in the end, it wasn't a commercial success.
He was very, very, very sad and disheartened that particularly smaller papers and smaller television stations did not at all appreciate the tremendous effort that went into these films and, just simply dismissed it.
After the initial flop of Barry Lyndon, Kubrick wanted to focus his attention on a project that would not only satisfy him, but the box office as well.
Kubrick's next project looked far more commercial. He seized the chance to make a film that would both satisfy him artistically and meet the demands of the box office.
In January of 1977, Stephen King published his 3rd novel, The Shining. One day, Kubrick was sitting in his office thinking of his next film idea, when his secretary brought him a stack of horror novels for him to read. Kubrick would read the first few pages of each book, and any time he'd found a story he disliked, he'd throw the book at the wall. Kubrick's secretary heard all of this, and at one point, the sound of the books hitting the wall stopped. After going through novel after novel, Kubrick set his eyes on Stephen King's The Shining and began reading. Kubrick's secretary came in and found Kubrick interested in Stephen King's best-selling horror story about an alcoholic husband, his wife, and his psychic son visiting a hotel for the winter, being exposed to a supernatural presence, and the father slowly going insane. After reading, Kubrick liked the story to an extent, but knew it needed to be changed drastically. So he took what he liked about the novel and put it into notes. When speaking about the theme of the film, Kubrick stated that, quote, "There's something inherently wrong with the human personality. There's an evil side to it. One of the things that a horror story can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly." Stephen King was ecstatic that Kubrick was adapting the Shining novel into a film after the success of the adaptation of his first novel, Carrie, in 1976, directed by Brian De Palma. King wrote a screenplay adaptation for The Shining and sent it to Kubrick. However, Kubrick threw King's screenplay out in favor of a screenplay written by him and called King's writing, quote, "weak." It's interesting to note here that Kubrick and King did in fact have a conversation on the phone, where Kubrick would talk about how optimistic ghost stories are.
I had a discussion with him beforehand. He said, "Stephen, Stanley Kubrick here. Don't you agree that all stories of ghosts are fundamentally optimistic?" I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, if there are ghosts, it means we survive death, and that's fundamentally an optimistic view, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Kubrick, what about hell?" And there was a long pause on the telephone line, and then he said in a very stiff and very different voice, "I don't believe in hell." And I thought to myself, well, that's fine, but some of us do, and some of us believe that ghosts may survive, and that may be hell.
After throwing out King's screenplay, Kubrick acquired the help of fellow novelist Diane Johnson to help co-write the film's screenplay. While discussing the screenplay, Kubrick and Johnson would discuss many pieces of literature, particularly Gothic horror. They would also discuss horror in general and particularly what scares us. After going through draft after draft and changing the story bit by bit, the final screenplay for The Shining was completed in 11 weeks. When it came to the Overlook Hotel for the film, King insisted on shooting the film in the hotel that inspired the novel. However, Kubrick knew that wouldn't work, so he built the sets of the Overlook Hotel on a soundstage at L Street Studios in England, and the exterior shots of the Overlook were shot at the Timberline Lodge at Mount Hood, Oregon. When it came to casting for the film, actors considered for the role of Jack Torrance were Robert De Niro, who was fresh off of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, Robin Williams, Harrison Ford, and even Christopher Reeve. You know, the best Superman ever. However, the role landed on Kubrick's first choice for the role, actor Jack Nicholson, who in 1978 had just stepped into the director's chair for himself and directed and starred in the film Going South. And a few years earlier, in 1975, had just won his first Oscar for his role in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
And the winner is Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
For the role of Wendy Torrance, the role went to actress Shelley Duvall. For the role of their son Danny Torrance, the role went to 5-year-old child actor Danny Lloyd, out of 4,000 kids. Kubrick's personal assistant, Leon Vitale, remembers the experience fondly.
His mom would say, "Come on, Daddy, we've come all this way, what have you." And suddenly he said, "Okay." And so he took my hand and we walked into his room. Then we sat on a chair about a foot away from each other and just stared at each other like this. And then he said, "Gee, I really like your suit." And that was it. From that moment, we were talking.
Danny Lloyd also remembers his experience fondly.
I think my dad heard something about it on the radio, and I think you were supposed to send a picture of your child in. And I think just kind of as a gag, my dad did. And after that, I think there was phone calls and a couple things until we went to our first audition.
For the role of the Overlook's manager, Stuart Ullman, the role went to actor Barry Nelson. For the role of the slaughtered Grady daughters, the role went to twin actresses Louise and Liza Burns. Leon Vitale also remembers this experience fondly.
I was getting really desperate, and suddenly on the very last day, this woman brought these two girls into the room, and they were twins. And the first thing that went through my head was Diana's famous photograph of these twins who look a bit weird. And I went running onto stage. "I got her, it's the ABE'S twins." And he looked at me and just said, "Well, there's no questions. That's it."
For the role of the Overlook chef, Dick Halloran, the role went to actor and musician Scatman Carruthers. For the role of Lloyd the bartender, the role went to actor Joe Turkel, who had previously worked with Kubrick on the film Paths of Glory in 1957. For the role of the Overlook's ghost, Delbert Grady, the role went to actor Philip Stone, who had previously worked with Kubrick on A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon. Pre-production, aka shooting, for The Shining would begin in May of 1978, and as the cast and crew would come to find out, they would not be shooting for 2 months, not 3 months, hell, not even 5 months. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining would take 13 months to complete.
Beginning when you said at the transition point. But Shelley, any part that the only thing, come and look at it, son. The only part clearly wrong was at the end when you said we've got to get him out of here, as you got strong at the end, and I think it has to be a last desperate begging, you know.
If there's one word that always gets brought up about Stanley Kubrick and his films, it's the word perfectionism. And nowhere is that more cleverly highlighted than the production of The Shining. Later in his career, Kubrick became infamous for the amount of effort he put into his films, that being his attention to detail, his actors' performances, or his hell of a lot of extra takes. Like, a lot of extra takes.
Stanley couldn't understand why you spend all this time and money preparing and getting to the actual moment of filming and then rush through the filming. He just felt that that was backwards, that he'd spent 5 years preparing this picture. He'd spent months and months building the sets. Now it comes to this moment, he's going to do 60, 70 tries to see what happens, even if take 5 is a terrific one.
Not only that, but Kubrick insisted on shooting the film in chronological order. And not only that, but Kubrick would change the script for the film daily. Jack Nicholson eventually got so frustrated with the daily script changes that he refused to read new pages because they were bound to change again the next day. Nicholson was also, in fact, shooting the film for so many long hours that there were actually days where he would pass out on set. However, there was no one on the set of The Shining that suffered more than Shelley Duvall and Scatman Carruthers. That being in the extensive amount of takes Kubrick made his actors do. Carruthers gave the hotel tour 85 times, and in the scene where him and Danny discuss the phenomenon of their psychic ability, one of the many close-ups of Carruthers in the sequence took 148 takes.
This scene between Scatman and Danny Lloyd has acquired almost legendary status. It may be the most number of takes in history for a single close-up, this one. Stanley did 148 takes of a 7-minute scene on this close-up. Finally, Scatman couldn't take it anymore. Stanley felt, I guess, cruel in some way and put an end to it.
The infamous scene where Halloran shines with Danny took Scatman almost 60 takes. It actually resulted in Carruthers crying, and his death scene took almost 50 to 60 takes.
Kubrick demanded numerous takes on his fall after he's been attacked by torrents. Carruthers recalled later on, "Somebody said something about me being too old to fall down that many times." And Jack Nicholson jumps up and says, "Who says my man's too old to fall down? Why, he can fall down 50 or 60 times if he has to. I wound up having to go to a chiropractor. I was hurting so bad. My arms and elbows and neck and head got kind of beat up."
However, nowhere is that near as bad as the infamous mistreatment of Shelley Duvall. This mistreatment included Kubrick being mean to Duvall on set, breaking her to her emotional limits, and ordering cast and crew members to barely give Shelley any sympathy throughout the production. Many of these heated moments were captured in Kubrick's daughter Vivian Kubrick's on-set documentary, Making The Shining.
It is 25 to 1.
Well, don't sympathize with Shelley. It doesn't help you, wouldn't it?
Yes, it does. It does.
There's no desperation. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
Should we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I can't
Yeah, but when you
hear.
came out like this, you should have just...
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute,
okay.
and then you say
Yeah,
on the radio,
but when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time now.
I can't even get this.
We're
However, Kubrick and Nicholson got around personally. Nicholson has his own words on the matter.
We had a good friendly relationship. I mean, he'd turn on you in a moment and say, "All right, you're the big fella. Let's see it." I mean, that's about as harsh as he ever got with me. I mean, he was a completely different director with Shelley.
To really tell you how bad things got with Duvall on set, the famous scene where Jack stalks Wendy up the stairs is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most amount of takes acquired for a scene. Not a close-up, a scene. The scene took 127 takes to perfect to Kubrick's liking. Also, the famous scene where Jack breaks the door down with an axe took 3 whole days to shoot before Kubrick was satisfied.
That's the one.
Things eventually got so bad for Duvall on set that she reportedly started losing her hair.
And the back got cut.
Need you trim those
Hunks of hair.
Oh, look.
Okay.
It just comes out.
Not only that, but Duvall eventually suffered a nervous breakdown on set. Some may call this scummy behavior, and to be honest, it is. But the reason for Kubrick's mistreatment of Duvall on set was for her character, to make her really feel horrified and terrified, and hysteric. Duvall actually once did an interview where she talked about the extensive amount of takes Kubrick wanted out of her.
Well, I talked to her while she was in this country, and I asked her about a rumour then strongly going the rounds that the meticulous Stanley Kubrick had made her do 127 takes of one of her scenes.
Well, I don't know. I think I'm supposed to say 18. But I don't know. I'll leave that to your imagination.
Well, let us assume that 18 is a slight underestimate and 127 is possibly closer to the truth. What is it like doing a take that many times? I mean, is it possible to keep going and produce a kind of freshness at the end?
Yes, it is. It's funny. It's something that I discovered during the making of The Shining, was that I had never done more than, say, 15 takes before in my life. So it was a great change for me to do so many. But then after you do a certain number, it sort of goes dead. And then 5 more takes or so, and it revives itself, and by then you know the scene like the back of your hand, and you can make no mistakes with it, and you forget all reality other than what you're doing. And it's like a miracle. It comes out better than it did before. And it's fresh, too.
Duvall also once talked about her excruciating time working with Kubrick.
For a person so charming and so likable, indeed lovable, he can do some pretty cruel things when you're filming, because it seemed to me at times that the end justified the means.
Here's Johnny.
It was a very difficult role. It was a long shoot, and I had to cry and hyperventilate and carry a little boy and run, for most of the time we shot. And that was about a year, a little over a year. And anywhere between 30 and 50 videotaped rehearsals before we even rolled film. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Why? Because of Stanley. And it was a fascinating learning experience. It was such intense work that I think it makes you smarter, but I wouldn't want to go through it again.
By far the actor that got the best out of the making of the film was 5-year-old Danny Lloyd, as Kubrick was fiercely protective of him, shooting many of the horrific horror scenes away from Lloyd's presence, risking scaring him. In fact, Lloyd didn't even know he was shooting a horror film until he saw the film years later. There were also scenes that Kubrick shot with Lloyd where Kubrick would instruct Lloyd on what to do through the megaphone.
Come on, score
Leon Vitali was also Lloyd's acting coach for the film, and him and Lloyd would joke around. Now, when it came to more of the extensive amount of takes of scenes for the film, the scene where the tennis ball rolls towards Danny took 50 takes. The scene where Jack and Grady talk in the bathroom about correcting Jack's family took 50 to 60 takes. The iconic scene of blood gushing out of the red elevator took almost an entire year to figure out how to set up and perfect to Kubrick's liking. And of course, along with Shelley Duvall, the infamous scene of Jack breaking the door down with an axe took nearly 100 takes, as well as the aforementioned 3 days. There's also an infamous clip of Jack preparing and getting ready to shoot the scene. Jack Nicholson also has his own words on the matter.
I always said, you know, when you work for Stanley, it removes the main problem for the actor, which is pressure. You know, he's not going to stop until it's exactly the way he wants it, right, wrong, or indifferent. It is going to be right.
Now, not every single friggin' scene in the film has been confirmed how many takes it took to shoot, but those are just some of the many stories. To shoot many of the iconic tracking shots for the film, one man was to do it all, and that man was Garrett Brown, the pioneer and creator of the Steadicam, and would later go on to shoot the famous stair scene from Rocky. The Shining was one of the first films to use Garrett Brown's creation, and was used throughout most of the film's production, including the opening credit sequence, which was shot by a second unit team in Glacier National Park in Montana by a helicopter, and the shadow of the helicopter can be seen in the uncropped 4x3 original DVDs. When it came to create the appearance of snow for the film, including the film's hedge maze, nearly 9,000 tons of dairy salt were shipped to L Street Studios. So really, while they were shooting the ending chase sequence, it was actually really hot. Speaking of the hedge maze, the design of it was extremely confusing. It was so confusing, in fact, that the cast and crew actually got lost in it, and someone had to work their way in with a diagram to get them out.
We could never find out where we were. We were always lost. We always had to shout and have somebody work their way in with a diagram and get us the hell out of there.
In fact, Stanley challenged, it was too easy, and he actually got lost in it. We challenged him, we put him in there one Saturday morning, and he couldn't find his way out.
While shooting the film, Kubrick would come up with many ideas on how to shoot scenes. Like during the filming of this classic scene, Kubrick came up with the idea of shooting the scene from below Jack.
Yeah. Well, that's not bad. Let's do that. Try that, Jack.
Wendy, listen to me. Let me out of here and I'll forget the whole damn thing. It'll be like it never happened.
You couldn't find some way of sort of not looking at her and looking down as you say the line.
This would be how the scene was shot.
Very good, Jack. Excellent. Right, check the gate, Doug.
Nicholson would often improvise scenes, like the scene where he'd throw the tennis ball at the wall, and of course the famous line, "Here's Johnny," was improvised by Nicholson on set after the famous catchphrase from The Tonight Show.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Johnny.
With 2 months left of production, another problem arose them. The set actually burned down due to the combustible heat from the intense lighting rig. There is an infamous photo of Kubrick laughing at the wreckage. Kubrick's daughter Vivian has her own words on the matter.
There was a giant fire, and this entire set here was destroyed, along with a couple of stages next door. And ridiculously enough, as the documentary director, I was in London transferring interview tapes of Jack, and I missed the whole thing, and I woke up to the phone ringing, and people saying, oh my God, I heard there was a fire. And I said, don't be ridiculous, I'm the documentary film director, I think I'd know if there'd been a fire. And after about the 4th phone call, I sort of leapt into my car and probably crashed into a police car and never made it to the studio. But, it was terrible. And It was one of the few days that it actually snowed in England, which was a disaster for the exterior set because it was all made of salt, so that was slowly turning into a slush pool as the rest of it was up in flames. And so there was quite a few heart stoppers on the film of like near total disasters.
The set was ultimately rebuilt with higher ceilings to make way for Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like I said, pre-production, aka shooting for The Shining, ultimately took a year and 1 month to complete shooting. This, like I said, was because of Kubrick's dogged perfectionism and attention to detail about everything in the film. And after all of this, The Shining finally completed shooting in 1979. And after that, post-production, aka editing for the film began. And after that, the film was finally released in 1980. However, even after its release, Kubrick was still not satisfied because the very next day, on the second day of the film's release, Kubrick requested the removal of a scene where Wendy and Danny are at the hospital and Mr. Ullman informs Wendy that the police could not find Jack's body. Kubrick requested the scene to be removed from all prints of the film that were playing at every theater, and on the very next day of the film's release, the scene was gone. The only evidence of the scene to ever be recovered are the shooting scripts and the behind-the-scenes Polaroids. After the removal of the scene, Kubrick was finally satisfied, and Stanley Kubrick's The Shining premiered on May 23rd, 1980.
Of terror that swept America is here. The Shining, a film by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, now playing in the West End and Sunday all over London. The Shining.
When The Shining premiered on May 23rd, 1980, the response was mixed, to say the least.
When The Shining was released, the response was mixed. Some people appreciated its riddles and ambiguities. Others felt that Kubrick had strayed too far from Stephen King's book.
Many reviews for the film were relatively critical and harsh. The New York Times said that the supernatural story knows frustratingly little rhyme or reason, and Variety magazine said that Stanley Kubrick has teamed up with Jumpy Jack Nicholson to destroy everything that was so terrifying about Stephen King's bestseller. The film was so panned at the time that it even received 2 Razzie Awards for Worst Director and Worst Actress. Obviously, because some people actually have a brain, neither won this honor. But perhaps no one was more disappointed with the film than Stephen King himself.
Did you like Kubrick's film of The Shining?
No. Cold. I'm not a cold guy. I mean, I think one of the things that people relate to in my books is there's a warmth, there's a reaching out and saying to the reader, I want you to be a part of this. And with Kubrick's The Shining, I felt that it was very cold.
He felt that Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance was a horrible casting choice and gave away his descent into madness almost immediately. He also felt that Shelley Duvall as Wendy was one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film.
Shelley Duvall as Wendy is really one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. She's basically just there to scream and be stupid, and that's not the woman that I wrote about.
Because of the poor reviews and low box office, when the film was getting ready for release out of the United States, Kubrick cut 29 minutes out of the film's runtime, ultimately cutting the film down from 2 hours and 23 minutes to 1 hour and 59 minutes. I have actually had the experience of watching this cut, and it's okay. It's definitely not bad, but there are some cuts I don't really agree with. As years would go by, the film would begin getting more praise as it grew in popularity on home video. Many people started looking at the film more favorably and discovering hidden messages and meanings. And don't worry, we will get to that in a minute. The Shining was actually one of the last 3 of Kubrick's films he would make. His last two films were 1987's Full Metal Jacket, and then 12 years later with 1999's Eyes Wide Shut, starring the at the time married couple Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. And he completed work on this film a few weeks before his death. So, yeah.
You just might have the wrong idea about one or two things.
The Shining soon premiered on television on ABC.
Tonight, an ABC premiere presentation. Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, the ultimate exercise in terror.
Anybody here?
A masterpiece of modern horror. The Shining.
Here's Johnny.
And when it premiered on ABC, it premiered with some very interesting edits, as well as some terrible dubbing.
I wouldn't touch one hair on his damn little head. I love the little son of a buck.
Come play with us, Daddy. Forever and ever and ever.
I'd do anything for him. Any freaking thing for him. Pig. I have let you foul my life so far, but I am not gonna let you foul this up. And it was 3 long damn years ago. A little moron has thrown all my papers all over the floor.
She tried to strangle Daddy.
Are you out of your freaking mind?
In 1999, after Kubrick's death, and to promote the release of Eyes Wide Shut, Warner Brothers quickly rushed to release a Stanley Kubrick Collection DVD box set, and The Shining was one of the films to get included. And yeah, it's definitely a really worn-out looking print if you ask me. In 2001, Warner Brothers digitally restored and remastered the Stanley Kubrick Collection DVDs, as well as The Shining. And yeah, it definitely looks a little bit better. In 2007, the film was re-released on Blu-ray, and is the version that is most commonly seen nowadays. Now, while many things have come out about how not one of these 3 versions of the film are accurate to how it originally looked, if you want to learn more about the subject, there's a video about it on YouTube which I will link in the description. In 2013, a feature-length documentary entitled Room 237 was released, detailing many people's interpretations and theories about the film. And it's a great documentary, but it's absolutely insane.
We're supposed to be focused on the 2 girls there. And then I saw, over on the left, I see the skiing poster. And the thing is that you already have Jack. He's already asked about skiing. Well, why isn't, what about skiing? Isn't the skiing good here in the hotel? And he's already given the story of why it isn't good, why they can't do that. But you've got the skiing poster, and my eye is drawn to it. And I realize that's not a skier. That's a Minotaur. It just leaped out at me. And so that was something that I was able to look at later on VHS and say, yes, I had actually seen a Minotaur there.
What? Some people in the documentary even go as far as saying that the whole movie is an admission by Kubrick that he helped fake the Apollo moon landing. However, there is no theory about The Shining that is more ridiculous than the dumbest Stanley Kubrick theory ever thought of by the human mind, that Stanley Kubrick was murdered by the Illuminati for trying to expose them in Eyes Wide Shut.
You serious?
Yep, that's a real theory. In 2016, Shelley Duvall appeared on the Dr. Phil show to discuss her being ill, a move which many people, including Kubrick's daughter, thought was a bad move on Dr. Phil's part. In 2018, the The Shining was added to the National Film Registry. In 2019, The Shining was re-released in 4K Ultra HD. Also in 2019, a sequel to The Shining, starring Ewan McGregor as an adult Danny Torrance, entitled Dr. Sleep, was released into theaters on November 8th, directed by Mike Flanagan, and was based on the 2013 novel of the same name, written by, of course, Stephen King. And it was a pretty damn good movie, all things considered. Finally, today, May 23rd, 2020, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining turned 40 years old. And throughout that 40 years, many people have declared it one of the greatest horror films of all time, if not the greatest horror film of all time. Something I wholeheartedly agree with. The Shining is not only one of my favorite films ever made, but may even be a contender for my favorite film of all time. Stanley Kubrick's filmography is one of the greatest filmographies ever created. In fact, 2001: A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange are also two of my favorite films of all time. But The Shining is a film that means a lot to me. I have referenced it a lot on this channel, and I will continue to do so. The Shining is a movie that is just incredible, and I've seen it so many times. In fact, I can't even count the amount of times I've turned this film on. While I do plan to talk about this film in more detail in later videos, what Stanley Kubrick and his collaborators did on this film is such an amazing piece of cinema. I am Abraham Stoker, and thanks for watching.
And a rendezvous. Your arms held a message tender, saying I surrender all my love to you. Midnight brought us sweet romance.